Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to another course in the Mythgard Academy series. This is now, I think this course should just about take us through the end of our third full year. We started in September of 2013, I think, or maybe it was October of 2013. It was right around there. Anyway, yeah. It's been such great fun. It was hard not to reflect back on so many of the courses we've done and the books we've read and discussed together. As I was thinking about The Lost Road, of course, made me think of all the other History of Middle-earth courses that we've done. I've also just been rereading Unfinished Tales, which I haven't read since we did Unfinished Tales together. And of course, reading that was just really full of great memories there too. Oh yes, I apologize. Several of you are pointing out that the chat room is not up on the Lost Road webpage, which is certainly true. I would probably the best thing to do there is just to go back to the Dracula page, which I think is still up, and to use that, I think, for now. I'll try to remember to get that put up. My apologies there. And just for those of you who are new, there is the way that you interact with me during the class is through your GoToWebinar control panel. There should be a little chat thing, text entry place. And when you type that, I see it in real time. So that's how I'm seeing the comments that people are writing now. But if you want to talk with each other during the class, which is totally optional, but if you do want to do that, we usually have a chat window up on the webpage. That's what I forgot. So you can go back to the Dracula page and it's there. Excellent, Mary. So good to see you. Oh, I'm so glad that you guys are able to make it. Very good. Very good. And Karita, I don't keep up with all the comments. I have to admit, I do some skimming, and I there are always times when I'll drop some of the comments and not see them all. So I always want to apologize to people whose comments I don't see. But you do get a little bit used to it. Over the years that I've been teaching in this interface, and I've come to really love it, actually. In some ways, it creates a much richer and fuller kind of interaction with the students. Certainly, it allows me to kind of hear more from you guys than I normally would if I just had to kind of laboriously call on you one by one, and you had to all take turns. Anyway. So welcome back to another course. So we're doing The Lost Road. The Lost Road and Other Writings, of course, as The Lost Road is only a small fraction of this volume, though it gives it the title. For those of you who people have expressed some concern, which is of course a perfectly rational concern as we get further and further into our run through the history of Middle-earth here. That is the concern. Obviously, are the other books a prerequisite? Is it okay if I jump in at this point? Answer: it is absolutely okay if you jump in at this point. Can't promise, of course, that I won't make any references back to stuff that we talked about before. But very little of what we say should be absolutely dependent upon that. My goal, whenever we do, really any book, but even when we do these, is really just to be focusing on a close reading of what we're seeing there in the text, and we'll be doing some comparison, of course. But anyway, is it possible to, is it absolutely necessary that you have to have been in all of the other sessions of all the other books? No, it's not. You'll be fine. Okay, so to start off with, I hope you'll be willing to indulge me for a few minutes, because I want to I want to kind of bring you guys up to speed. I don't know, some of you I think haven't. I gave State of the University address for Signum recently, and was announcing a bunch of really, really big changes in the Signum program. And so I hope you'll indulge me for a couple minutes while I pause to show you some of those things, because there's a bunch of these things which I think are particularly exciting for serious Tolkien fans. And if you have showed up to watch and participate in a discussion of The Lost Road, you are a serious Tolkien fan, so you should be aware of this, because there are big things afoot with Signum University, which is of course the parent institution of the Mythgard Institute. Lots, over the last especially year, there has been a lot of growth and maturing kind of behind the scenes at Signum University as we've really developed our staff and our communications, and we've really begun to build a really solid core to move forward. And this year, there's this sort of we're finally getting to kind of the outward flowering of that in our program itself, and it's really, really fun. The Signum University has been offering this sort of series of really awesome courses on Tolkien, especially, but on other kinds of imaginative literature, other fantasy works and concepts. Germanic philology and medieval literature and all that kind of thing. We've offered this series of really awesome classes, and for those of you who have been following us for a long time, you'll know that basically kind of life with Signum University to this point has been this kind of suspense over when are we going to announce what the courses are going to be next term, and it's been kind of a fun surprise, but it's really been a kind of semester by semester thing, and that is really all changing this year. So I want to, we've really developed things into a much more sort of cohesive program of study, and I wanted to kind of show you a little bit about that. This is our new website, which is pretty awesome, signumuniversity.org, so yeah, I just wanted to kind of give general props, of course, to our website. But of course, for those of you in this class might be especially interested in our Tolkien Studies program. So see, we now have a instead of just a bunch of cool Tolkien classes, we have an actual Tolkien Studies program, so that you can see if you've ever thought about coming to study Tolkien Studies with us, well, you can see exactly what you would be kind of getting in on. Here's some of our awesome faculty. Tom Shippey, Verlin Flieger, John Garth, and also me, and the awesome faculty plus me. These are sort of the core courses of our Tolkien Studies program. These are the courses that we're now committing. We're going to be offering these courses every 2 years. So it's not like, oh yeah, there were these awesome courses a while back, but I missed it, and now what happens? We're going to be offering these courses in a regular cycle and rotation. So if you come to do Tolkien Studies with us, you can count on taking these classes, and so you can see. You can see what the kinds of Tolkien Studies courses you can take. Some of them are really in-depth studies of sort of the primary Tolkien texts, like my Story of the Hobbit class, which we're offering this fall. Verlin Flieger's wonderful seminar on Tolkien's World of Middle-earth. It's really her in-depth look at the Lord of the Rings. The course that I co-taught with Tom Shippey, which I called Beyond Middle-earth, meaning basically all of Tolkien's writings other than his Middle-earth writings. So we were looking at his short fiction, many of his poems, his scholarship, and his Anglo-Saxon work, and some of his essays, all that kind of, all that sort of the other Tolkien stuff. There's the poetry class that I did, where I was looking at all of his short poetry, not the really long stuff, like not the Lays of Beleriand, but the short poems, all the way from sort of a chronological look at those, from the earliest ones that we have when Tolkien was a teenager, all the way through his later revisions when he was in his 70s. And anyway, and then there's lots of other courses which really kind of take you in depth in a particular angle of Tolkien, or a particular sort of relationship of Tolkien, like Tom Shippey's Beowulf through Tolkien class, John Garth's wonderful Tolkien's Wars in Middle-earth class, where you really do an in-depth look at Tolkien's own experience in World War I and its connection to his works. If you're familiar with John Garth's wonderful book Tolkien in the Great War, that's kind of at the heart of this course, but he looks at a lot more stuff other than what's just talked about in that book. My comparison, my sort of close comparison of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, looking at how the two of them treat when they're sort of doing similar things or treating similar topics. How do they do it, right? And what are the sort of the similarities and differences between them? So these are, as I said, these are our core courses. We also will be offering new classes periodically as well. Like this coming summer, we're going to have a new Tolkien class, which we're going to be offering, which is going to be a class on Tolkien in the 20th century, and not just Tolkien's own sort of take on the 20th century or Tolkien's own context in the 20th century, as John Garth was doing, but also looking at sort of the responses to Tolkien in the 20th century and the ways in which sort of Tolkien has kind of fit in the 20th century, which should be really, really fun. And that's going to be taught by Dr. Sarah Brown, who's been with us on our faculty now for several years as a preceptor, and she's going to be lecturing in that class this coming summer. Anyway. So this is just to give you a sense of of sort of the scope of our Tolkien Studies program. And this, of course, is only one of our programs. We have 4 different concentrations that we are offering at Signum now. And of course, you'll be writing a thesis and doing original research with, partnered with many of these scholars that we've worked with. We have, people doing, they've done work with people who have done work with like Dimitri Fimi and with Doug Anderson and a number of our own faculty, Verlin Flieger, of course. And anyway, it's really cool. So yeah, Jana, they do rotate every 2 to 3 years. You can always complete the program within 3 years, definitely. Most of our students, no, all of our students so far have been part-time students. Almost everybody absolutely everybody in our program is doing their studies with us in addition to, the rest of their life that they're doing. So that's quite common. And so therefore, for that reason, people often take 2, 3, or 4 years to finish the program. But yes, you will be able to, even within 2 years, you should be able to complete the program. And then, they will kind of cycle around again if you missed them, on the first time through. And just to give you kind of a glimpse of our other concentrations, again, it's not only Tolkien Studies. We have our Imaginative Literature program, which covers, again, other fantasy, science fiction, and other genres. So you can see the courses that we have here. We have an even broader array of courses. Things like this fall we're offering Sherlock Science and Ratiocination again. That's the Amy Sturgis's Introduction to the History of the Mystery genre, for instance. Folkloric Transformations, our newest live class, which I'm going to get back to later on. The course which Doug Anderson is teaching right now this semester, the Inklings in Science Fiction. My Modern Fantasy classes, the Star Wars class, the Lovecraft class, Doug Anderson's awesome Roots of the Mountain class, where he was looking at early fantasy, like fantasy literature before Tolkien, from like the George MacDonald time period, up through Tolkien's time. Amy Sturgis's marvelous 2-semester science fiction historical survey. Anyway, there's just a lot, the King Arthur class by Verlin Flieger. Really, really, really cool stuff. And then we've got our Germanic philology concentration, where you can be studying Old Anglo-Saxon. We're introducing Old Norse this year for the first time. We've got our Beowulf translation seminar, as well as the Tom Shippey's Beowulf class, my 2-semester Chaucer class, our philology class, the one that Tom Shippey and Nelson Goring did a couple years back, the Philology Through Tolkien class. We're looking at a follow-up to that, a sort of a sequel, a Philology 2 class that we're working on. And let's see, where was I? I was here, right? Okay, and finally, one that we've been kind of expanding out into more lately, and that's what we sometimes call courses that other people also offer, namely our classical, medieval, and Renaissance lit classes. Anyway, so we've got our new Shakespeare class, which we're doing in the fall, in the spring, Shakespeare in the Middle Ages, which I'm really excited about. Anyway. These are our different concentrations that people can, so you can sort of enter into any of these courses of studies. You can kind of mix and match a little bit. Our tuition is really low, as it's always been. We offer courses for a fraction of the price of any other American institution. The full credit enrollment in our classes is only $575 per course for a 3-credit class, and all of our classes are at their core live and interactive. So you'll get to to meet and get to know that your professors and really be involved in a small group discussion. We do also have a work study program in which many of our students participate, in which you can, for sort of working and helping out on the Signum staff, you can also get partial or full tuition remission. So that's another thing that we sometimes do. Anyway, so this and maybe you're so this is our master's degree program, our Master's of Arts program, and you might be thinking that I don't really need a Master of Arts, but so we have a new thing this year also, which is our new certificate program. So you can take the 5 classes for credit and get a certificate. I know not everybody needs a master's degree in language and literature, but if you want to absolutely cement your status as like the biggest geek around the water cooler, our certificate program is pretty awesome. So again, it would really give you a chance to dig into studying some of these books and works and authors that you love, and really just kind of enrich your understanding of these fields in a really deep way, but not having to go through the entire process and write a thesis and everything. You just complete the certificate after 5 courses. So anyway, that's a new option that we have this term as well. These are the classes that we're offering this coming fall, starting at the end of August. This is the Beowulf in Old English. This is our translation course. So auditors can't participate in this because this is not a lecture course at all. This is 100% small group discussion as people who have taken Anglo-Saxon before. We offered our intro to Old English, to Anglo-Saxon for the first time last year, and we're offering it again this fall. But this is sort of the follow-up to that. It's our Beowulf translation seminar. So, in small groups with the professors, we're going to be sitting through and just translating, reading our way through Beowulf in the original, and doing your own translations. We've got the Story of the Hobbit class, the Sherlock class, Verlin Flieger's Tolkien and Tradition class, which I didn't mention before. That's a look at Tolkien and his relationship with all of those older traditions that really influenced him so strongly. The Finnish Kalevala, the Arthurian literature stuff, the Norse tradition, all that, Beowulf, all that stuff. And, of course, as I said, the introduction to Anglo-Saxon. I also want to draw particular attention to Dr. Dimitra Fimi's Folkloric Transformations class, which is a brand new class that we're offering live this semester. Dr. Fimi is wonderful, one of the foremost Tolkien scholars in the world, a wonderful teacher, and she's doing this class on folklore. And in particular, what she's wanting to do here is to look at some of the roots of folklore stories and look at their development and transformation over time, and in particular, the way that they've been transformed in our modern culture, especially in sort of modern stories and films. And one of the things that she's going to be really focusing on, for those of you who took the last Mythgard Academy class with me, is on vampire stories. So if you didn't get quite enough vampire stuff in the Dracula class, there is another opportunity for you. You could take or you could audit Dimitra Fimi's Folkloric Transformation class. She's going to talk about Buffy, which I didn't get to. I didn't include Buffy in my Dracula class. But anyway, so this I encourage you to look more at this. Dr. Fimi is just a wonderful, wonderful teacher. So strongly recommend that. I would just say, sort of in kind of closing about that, if you have never tried one of our classes for credit, I encourage you to try one. If you have, in the past. I know there were a bunch of people who kind of took a course once, and sort of life has kind of happened since then, and you haven't come back to it. I would encourage you to kind of try us now. A lot has changed, and there's a lot of things I think you won't recognize. We still have the same core teaching, the same core wonderful academic content, but the entire Signum experience is really changing a lot. Has changed a lot already, and is changing a lot more this year in lots of really, really good ways. So I would encourage you to think about that. Think about it. Think about maybe coming back and finishing a certificate, for instance. Now, let me just end here by saying a quick word to our auditors. Now, if many of you have audited classes with us before, where you don't take the class for credit, you don't write the papers, and you don't do the exams or anything like that, you just get to sit in on the lectures, and that's fun. There are, of course, two things. One is that a new thing that we started this last year, is our discussion auditor option. Because a lot of auditors have always wished that they could participate in the discussion sections as well, the weekly live discussions. So now we have that option. It's called our discussion auditor seat. So you can enroll as a discussion auditor. But another thing. So you'll notice that with a lot of these classes, of course, are repeats, because one of the things that we're really wanting to do in solidifying our program is that we're repeating, of course, a lot of our classes, so that we can really promise that people are able to get the benefit of the full program that we offer. But I know that means for those of you who have been auditing our classes that maybe you've already audited those classes before. I offered my Story of the Hobbit class back in the fall of 2012. Maybe a lot of people signed up for that then. Maybe you were one of those who took that then, and you're like, oh man, now there are kind of fewer classes each term that I can audit now. Fewer sort of new classes, and I do understand that. I want to say two things. If that's you, I want to say two things to you. One is there are still definite opportunities. Again, the Folkloric Transformations class. This is our biggest audit class this semester. So we do have, and we will continue to have new classes where we'll be bringing in new lecturers with live lecture sessions and brand new material. So we will be doing that every single semester. But the other thing is that, I despite the fact that, I made the choice that we did need to make this change that we've made to our academic content so that we could really develop our programs, I didn't want to leave the auditors behind. I don't want to sort of leave you out. So we have a new series of seminars that we're going to be offering because we want to keep providing stuff for you all. We want to be able to continue enabling you to really dig into things as auditors always have been able to do. So I'm going to be announcing the first one of these very soon. The registration and everything for the first of our new series of seminars, which I'm calling Tolkien's New Works. So we're going to be doing with great scholars from around the world. We're going to be doing these sort of in-depth looks at these the works that Christopher has been publishing over the last 5 to 10 years. So we're going to have a seminar on A Secret Vice, which was just published, and very recently, in the last week, published in America finally, edited by our own Signum's own Dr. Andrew Higgins and by Dimitra Fimi together, and the two of them are going to lead a seminar on A Secret Vice. It'll be I believe a 3-part seminar, so 3 different weeks, like a Mythgard Academy class, but 3 weeks long. And it will be run by Dr. Higgins and Dr. Fimi, so they can give you sort of the inside scoop on that work. We're also similarly going to have a series on The Fall of Arthur. We're going to have a series on Tom Shippey has agreed to do a seminar on Tolkien's Beowulf with us, looking at specifically the Tolkien's Beowulf edition that was published a couple years back, and all of Tolkien's materials in there. Verlin Flieger is going to do a session on the Kullervo, which was just published last year. Anyway, so that's all the I'm hoping that we're going to also do we're also going to do a Sigurd and Gudrun one after that. So those are going to be coming up over the next 6 to 9 months. We're going to be doing those intermittently. So I hope that will help to, that in addition, of course, the Mythgard Academy is going to keep going as well. So I hope between all these things we'll be able to help to keep you, off the streets and out of the pool halls as we move forward. Okay. The Lost Road. I don't want to get too distracted, but as you can see, I'm really excited about what we're doing at Signum and about our program and how it's developing. I hope you will take a look at it and share it with your friends and let people know, because I know that there are a lot of people. We often hear from people. The new applicants to our program, who say, like, I can't believe this really exists. I've been wishing I could study this stuff, in this kind of depth for my whole life. Where has this been? And I know that there are a lot of people who really feel that way and would feel that way, but haven't heard about it yet. So I hope you'll help us in kind of spreading the word about that. All right. Okay. Let's talk about the Lost Road. So let's do a quick recap of volumes 1 through 4 of the History of Middle-earth. The main thing is, of course, you'll remember the overall purpose of the History of Middle-earth series in Christopher Tolkien's mind was to sort of explain the growth of the Silmarillion material specifically. It was, there's a sense in which the History of Middle-earth series is a massively over-the-top response to criticisms of the Silmarillion, and basically, readers of the Silmarillion wondering and speculating how much of this is really Tolkien and how much of this was Christopher Tolkien filling in the blanks, right? Since it was published, posthumously, and it wasn't really made clear in the Silmarillion. So Christopher Tolkien, in the preface to Volume 1, is like, oh yeah? Fine. You want to know? I'll show you. And so he shows much, much more than anyone could possibly have guessed he would about how this stuff grew. So it begins, of course, in the first 2 volumes, the books of Lost Tales, Book of Lost Tales, Volume 1 and 2. Really no separation between them. It was the same project, just divided into the two different volumes by Christopher in the publication. But the Lost Tales were Tolkien's original stories. So when Tolkien first sat down to write the very first Middle-earth stories that he wrote were the Lost Tales. And it's essentially it gives the history of what we have come to think of as the First Age. And we'll come to talk about that a good deal more this evening. And many of the stories that we know, there are lots of things that are quite different about the Book of Lost Tales compared to the published Silmarillion stories with which people are more familiar. But a lot of the elements go way back to that. The fall of Gondolin, Earendil and the fall of Gondolin, the voyage of Earendil, though that's pretty different. The darkening of Valinor, the story of Turin Turambar, the story of Beren and Luthien, many differences in all those things, but a lot of those sort of fundamental elements are there in the Book of Lost Tales. But it's really cool to look at and sort of see not just kind of what those stories looked like then, but kind of where Tolkien's mind was back then and how he looked at things. So that's really interesting. The Lays of Beleriand is then after that. So it's in the late teens and early 20s that he's working on the Lost Tales, but he doesn't quite finish it as usual. He abandons it, and it looked like he had basically decided he wanted to sort of shift how he was doing the whole frame, because the frame story was of this historical English dude, this like medieval English dude who traveled to Tol Eressëa, to Elvenhome, and sort of ended up there on the island and heard all these stories. Was at the Cottage of Lost Play and was told all these stories by the elves there of Tol Eressëa, and. So he decided to totally change the frame of the narrator. He's going to change from Ariel, who is the original narrator, to Alfwine. And that encompassed that involved a bunch of change. So he was going to have to go back and revise a whole bunch of things. And it seemed like he kind of ran out of steam at that point. And he never came back and finished the Book of Lost Tales completely. In particularly to the detriment of the Eärendil story, which was never fully articulated. Lots of stuff about it and lots of hints about what he was thinking and lots of kind of conflicting narrative scraps, but no real coherent story of Eärendil, which is quite a shame, as it was really going to be the crowning sort of the biggest, most important story in the whole book, as the Book of Lost Tales seemed to have been projected. But he didn't finish it. Instead, what he decides to do is to shift to some of the major elements. So rather than going back to that whole collection of stories, that sort of cohesive collection of stories, bound together within that frame of these elves telling these stories to the human Ariel, or Alfuin and later on, instead of going that way and writing this big compendium of all these stories, he decided instead, I'm just going to focus on like the big stories, the stories that he was most invested in. And he was going to write sort of the full version of those stories, really flesh those out more and really invest in those particular stories. And P.S., he decided to do this in poetry, right? He just decided to do all this in verse. So we got several of those. Now, there's snippets of the, not snippets, a goodly bit, a couple hundred lines of a poetic treatment of the kinslaying. There's a one about the fall of Gondolin, but he abandoned those pretty quickly. The two that he really stuck with longest were the Children of Hurin, the Turin-Turambar story, which is written in alliterative verse, based sort of modeled after Beowulf. And the Lay of Leithian, the Beren and Luthien story, which was written in rhyming couplets. And that's, of course, Volume 3, The Lays of Beleriand, is primarily the Lay of Leithian and the alliterative Children of Hurin, which we spent a class looking at. And those stories are really, really neat. We can see some ways in which kind of the larger world of the story is sort of taking shape in the background around it. There are some things about it that change over the course of the articulation of those two stories. But it's not what his focus was on, right? His focus was on developing those two big primary stories. Now, after that, we get to the Shaping of Middle-earth. And the Shaping of Middle-earth is where he kind of left those aside. Of course, needless to say, he didn't finish either the Children of Hurin or the Lay of Leithian. We came reasonably close with the Lay of Leithian. It's at least not just a little fragment. He got all the way up through the flight from Angband after the taking of the Silmaril. So that's pretty good. I mean, I would really have loved to see what he did with the Song of Luthien and the Resurrections and all that stuff, where that was headed exactly. Would have loved to see that in the Lay of Leithian, but I got to be thankful for what we have of the Lay of Leithian. In the Shaping of Middle-earth, he seemed to sort of come back again, and this seemed to happen, and this is our last class on the Shaping of Middle-earth, this seemed to happen more or less accidentally. That is, and it was because of the poems, he was going to send out the Children of Hurin for somebody else to read. Well, he did send it out for somebody else to read. But, being Tolkien, he decided like some context was needed, because although he took those stories out of his larger collection, right, out of the Book of Lost Tales, he chose, the Children of Hurin story and the Beren and Luthien story, and decided to really focus on them and expand them. Still, he couldn't totally just rip them out and act as if they were totally freestanding stories, right? His whole larger legendarium story was still kind of obviously in his heart, because when he sends the Children of Hurin off to this other reader, he feels compelled to write this synopsis of this sketch of the mythology, as he called it. So the sketch of the mythology is a prose, it's a prose epitome, a prose synopsis of the entire story from the Ainulindalë up through the War of Wrath at the end of what we now think of as the First Age. And again, it was just designed to accompany the Children of Hurin. It becomes, he gets carried away in writing it, as he was so wont to do. When doing this kind of thing, most of his outlines turn into something bigger after he gets started with them. And this seemed to be a mode, this kind of single synopsis, not this sort of set of short stories essentially kind of set within the frame that we had in the Lost Tales. This sort of plot summary version of it was something, and this is one of the things we looked at a lot in the last class, seemed to be a place where kind of surprisingly he decided to sort of sit down and live, where he was like, yeah, I like the plot summary mode. And so he started revising it and redoing it. And that's where the Quenta came from. So the Quenta, what he called the Quenta, was basically an expansion of that plot summary, and it's now it's in different parts, and it's significantly longer, and this is kind of the origin of the eventual published Silmarillion. This is where the mode of the published Silmarillion comes from. This kind of overview of these stories, rather than kind of the again this sort of series of short stories set within a different frame, the Book of Lost Tales version. So no, he decides he's going to do this plot summary thing, and he begins to write other material to kind of flesh it out. There's the maps that he drew, which we looked at in the last class. There's the Embarcanta, which is his sort of account of the cosmos, really, and the whole kind of larger cosmology of Middle-earth. And then he started writing these annals, the Annals of Aman, and the Annals of Valinor, and the Annals of Beleriand. This was just sort of year by year chronology of the events, which are sort of designed to accompany the Quenta, and kind of a different way of presenting these things. All of this material kind of together seems to now be the Silmarillion. Like all of this stuff together, it seems to be how he's increasingly beginning to think of the Silmarillion, and now we've kind of left the bigger, longer, epic versions of those stories, what he was working on in the Ways of Beleriand, further and further behind. Now, thing to keep in mind, chronologically, where are we? So, okay, I said the Lost Tales were in the late teens and early 20s. It was in the 20s that he was working on the poems, up through that he did the Children of Hurin first, and then he kind of abandoned that. Well, really, there was kind of I'm almost tempted to call it like a hostile takeover of the Children of Hurin by the story of Beren and Luthien. For those of you who studied that with me will remember those bits in the Children of Hurin where the story of Beren and Luthien comes up in the Children of Hurin, and it just like expands and takes over like an entire canto of the Children of Hurin. It's like that story was just kind of bursting out of him, and eventually he stops fighting it and just sits down and does the Lay of Leithian. But anyway, so the Lay of Leithian comes second, and that's in the late 20s up to the very early 30s. He's doing the Lay of Leithian. And this other Silmarillion stuff, the Sketch of the Mythology, was written in 1930. The Quenta came soon thereafter. So we're looking at the very early 30s for that material that I was describing from the Shaping of Middle-earth volume. That brings us now up, but the thing to remember, before we bring us now to the current volume, the thing to remember is that time period, 1930, between 1930 and 1933, is also when he's writing The Hobbit. Okay, so we have come up to the point which is now contemporary with sort of like the Tolkien that everybody knows and loves, right? So we have to think, and we talked about this quite a bit when we were in the Shaping of Middle-earth class, looking back and forth. For instance, we have every reason to think, for instance, that his depiction of the dwarves in the Quenta, back in the Shaping of Middle-earth, that's pretty much what he had in mind when that's what dwarves were to him when Thorin and company show up at Bilbo's doorstep in The Hobbit, and that's kind of an eye-opener to look at that kind of thing. So The Hobbit was being written at the time of the Shaping of Middle-earth material. What we're going to be looking at in The Lost Road and other works and other writings is basically the stuff that he was working on between finish. It's sort of after the Silmarillion stuff in the previous volume, of course, but it's also between the writing of The Hobbit and the writing of The Lord of the Rings. He sat down, he began writing The Lord of the Rings in about 1937, which was the publication of The Hobbit. The Hobbit was published in September of 1937, and it was very quickly successful, and the publishers began to clamor for a sequel, and that's when he really began to sit down and write what would eventually develop into The Lord of the Rings. That was 1937. Again, he finished the writing of The Hobbit in 1933. There was a 4-year gap while there was a lot of sort of revising and toing and froing with the publisher and everything, and delays. So anyway, yeah. So during that time is that's the window that we're looking at here before he really turns his thoughts much more fully to the writing of The Lord of the Rings. That, of course, is where we would be headed next, should the electorate choose to continue this series. I don't, because for those of you who aren't familiar with the Mythgard Academy, I don't choose the books for these classes. These are elected by our supporters. We are completely fan-funded. And so for for everyone who has participated in our fundraising, they get to vote and choose which books that we which we do. So if the electorate chooses to continue our History of Middle-earth discussion, the next volume is The Return of the Shadow, and that's the beginning of the 3-volume look at the development of The Lord of the Rings. So we'll be looking at sort of how The Lord of the Rings grew in Tolkien's mind, which is a really fascinating study. But this volume, we're getting in that window. Now, after The Hobbit's done, before The Lord of the Rings is started, what's he doing? What's he working on? And this, of course, is where we finally come around to one of the major elements that's been missing in the Silmarillion material so far, that is missing from the point of view of the published Silmarillion, and that's the Numenor stuff, or really more broadly, anything past the First Age. As I've been saying, we think of all that Silmarillion stuff, all this, like, we think of that stuff which has been the entire content of Tolkien's Middle-earth output to this point. We've been thinking of that as First Age material, right? Coming from a Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, especially Lord of the Rings point of view, that's how we think of it, right? That's back in the First Age of Middle-earth. But of course, remember that the end of the First Age was originally the end, right? This was the whole story. There wasn't the idea of First Age, Second Age, Third Age, Fourth Age was very far from Tolkien's mind. You could say that he had something like 2 ages in mind, right? That is like the age of the firstborn, and then the age of men, the time of the dominion of men, which came afterwards. But he didn't really use that terminology, First Age and Second Age, in there. So going back to the Book of Lost Tales, going back to sort of the original concept, like what exactly Tolkien was writing stories about in the first place, right? One way to characterize what he was writing stories about in the first place in all of his Silmarillion material is kind of, how did things get to be the way they are? I mean, now, in our world, right? The world which is dominated by men but haunted by stories of elves, right? And with this sort of hint of sort of magic and fairy influence that can perhaps be sensed in certain places and all these things. I mean, he wrote lots of poems about that kind of thing, especially back in the teens and 20s and 30s. We have, the elves have faded, right? So now they are almost never seen, largely absent, almost entirely invisible if they are still around. But the land and sort of human folklore and consciousness retains the memory of their influence, right? So there's a sense in which all of Tolkien's Silmarillion work is kind of giving us a sort of a theoretical, here's how this situation came to be. So the end of the stories, the end of his stories, was always the time of the fading of the elves, explaining how we got to the place where we are now, how we got to the place where the elves have faded and the men have taken over. So the end of the First Age is the end of the stories, and the curtain is coming down, not just on like one particular age of Middle-earth, but on the elves, right? On the firstborn entirely in the world. It's really a passing from the Elder Days into the modern world, really. Of course, we would call that time the early medieval world, but it's the modern world. I mean, to Tolkien, that's modern, right? Okay. So again, so to us, as we think about the Silmarillion tradition, especially if we're focused on the Lord of the Rings, and we think back over the history of Middle-earth, sort of backwards from the third or fourth age of Middle-earth, Numenor seems like this is this huge thing, right? I mean, it seems almost inevitable to us from a four-age perspective, right? The Elder Days of Middle-earth, and then the fading time, but the fading time is extended, right, through the second and even the third ages of the world, and Numenor looms really large. But from the original vantage point, from the original place where Tolkien was in telling these stories, Numenor and the story of the fall of Numenor is far from inevitable, even far from necessary, even in a sense far from logical. It's more like an unanticipated sequel. By unanticipated sequel, what I mean is not one of those like sequels that comes after a book which ends with like an obvious teaser for a potential sequel. You all know what the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? When movies will do that or books will do that, leave an obvious opening for the next book, right? Tolkien's discussion of the Elder Days did not end with an obvious teaser for an upcoming sequel, right? It was very much of a this is the end of the stories of the Elder Days and the beginning of what will come into just humdrum modern history, essentially, right? And maybe there might be something interesting to tell about the transition in there, but it's not really. It's certainly not a continuation of the Elder Days story, right? So the idea that he's going to take a new story, the story of Numenor, and add it at the end, right? And therefore, in doing so, extend and really quite radically alter the whole texture, really, of the ending, of the fading of the elves. It's a huge deal, and it involved him actually going back and reworking, making the end of the now the first age much less final than it had been before, because again, conceptually, it was really pretty final. So in order to accommodate this new story, he had to really rewrite a lot of, sort of really rethink a lot of things, because it's very different. This is not just sort of the fading of the firstborn and the handing off to men. The Númenórean story is quite different. So let us finally, it's been almost an hour, but not quite. Let's finally go to the text and start my now largely implausible number of slides that I want to get through from the fall of Numenor. The first thing I want to address is the slip that Christopher Tolkien eventually and sort of hesitantly concludes that his father made. If you didn't read sort of the introduction or that first piece, Christopher Tolkien talks about, what he's talking about is there are passages in Tolkien's letters when he explicitly says that there existed, like he had written Númenórean stuff, right? He had written the story of the fall of Numenor that was unattached to Middle-earth. It was not part of the Elder Days at all. It was its own independent, it was just like a totally separate story he was writing. And then after that, after having written that, at some point after that, he decided to come back and integrate it into the story of Middle-earth, right? So he remembered that, and this letter is written 30 years after the fact. It's written in the 60s, okay? And so Christopher Tolkien was quoting those letters and kind of trying to account for that. And he says, Christopher says that, basically all of the evidence, all the documentary evidence suggests that Tolkien was wrong about that. All of the stuff, that he wrote that survives at all about Numenor, and it seems like it's the earliest stuff. It's hard to imagine fully written versions of this story which predated this material, is clearly part of the Middle-earth story from the very beginning, right? So let's look at Christopher's discussion of this. I conclude, therefore, that Numenor, as distant and formalized conception, whatever Atlantis haunting, as my father called it, lay behind. I'll explain that in a minute. arose in the actual context of his discussions with C.S. Lewis in, as seems probable, 1936. Okay, so first of all, let's go sentence by sentence here. He says, first of all, did the idea of the fall of Numenor predate the Lost Road material? You know, he's been Christopher's just been talking about the famous coin toss that J.R.R. Tolkien did with C.S. Lewis when they decided one of them was going to write a space travel story, the other was going to write a time travel story, and they tossed a coin, and Tolkien got time travel and Lewis got space travel. The space travel story, of course, became Out of the Silent Planet, the first of Lewis's space trilogy. And Tolkien's time travel story was The Lost Road, which we're going to be talking about next week. So Christopher Tolkien is first saying that all of the evidence suggests that the Numenor story simply emerged from Tolkien's thoughts about the time travel story, right? So when he tossed up with C.S. Lewis in 1936, that's when the Numenor story was born in his mind. There does lay something behind it, though, which is this Atlantis haunting. More on that in a little bit. A passage in the 1964 letter can be taken to say precisely that. I began an abortive book of time travel, The Lost Road, of which the end was to be the presence of my hero in the drowning of Atlantis. This was to be called Numenor, the land in the west. Moreover, Numenor was from the outset conceived in full association with the Silmarillion. There was never a time when the legends of Numenor were unrelated to the main mythology, as he claimed in that letter. My father erred in his recollection, or expressed himself obscurely, meaning something else. The letter cited above was indeed written nearly 30 years later. So, Christopher, and he's always so hesitant when he does this, right? When he says, like, I think that my dad was just wrong when he remembered this. Now, I'm drawing attention to this, not because I'm wanting to make a big deal about the fact that Tolkien made a mistake about this. I mean, can I just start off by saying I find that the most natural thing in the world? I mean, don't ask me for an account of what's going on now in 30 years, because it won't make any sense. I mean, I am sure that 30 years from now, I'm going to think we had a Tolkien Studies and an Imaginative Literature concentration from the very beginning of Signum University. But anyway, whatever. It's just, it's totally understandable that Tolkien would might make a mistake and misremember how stories emerged many years back. And there are many examples of this, of him saying something in a letter or in a talk. Like, for instance, when he said that he said that Farmer Giles of Ham was the first of his stories that he ever actually composed on the typewriter. No, actually he didn't. There's a manuscript that came before it, and you can find the manuscript, and there it is, right? It's pretty obvious that it came before the typescript. But whatever. It's fun. My point is not to make a big deal of that. To me, though, the question to me is, why did Tolkien make this particular mistake? That is, okay, so what this suggests, assuming that it was in fact a mistake and not him just expressing himself obscurely, as Christopher Tolkien suggests. I don't know what he would be meaning if he weren't meaning that. But anyway, so my question is, why this mistake, right? So 30 years down the road, he had a narrative in his own mind about the birth of the Numenor story and the Lost Road. And he had the story that he had in his own head was that the story of Numenor predated the Middle-earth, not predated all the Middle-earth materials, but that it had an independent existence prior to being merged into the Middle-earth material. Now, that turns out to be untrue. The untruth of it isn't what I find interesting. What I find interesting is, why is it that he would have... I don't think that's just a random mistake, right? Why is it that story, that version of the story, really took root in Tolkien's own mind? Now, I don't know the answer to this. Nobody knows the answer to this. Christopher doesn't know, and he knows more than anybody else. But I have a guess. Keep in mind, this is a guess, me guessing. Don't know, not claiming to know. Want to make sure that's clear. But here's my guess. My guess is it suggests, it shows that Tolkien in his later days retained a memory of this. Obviously, there's some sense in which the Numenor story was independent. I don't think he just kind of made that up or totally slipped a cog. There's a reason why years later he held on to the idea that the Atlantis business, the Numenor stuff, was in some sense independent. The documentary evidence suggests it was never independent of the Middle-earth story. So in what sense is that? What's the root? What's the seed of that later thought of Tolkien's? And I think it comes back to the Atlantis haunting. And that's what I really want to emphasize. The Atlantis haunting, many of you know this story, but I'll tell it to for those of you who don't know this story. Tolkien was always fascinated by Atlantis, and for rather personal reasons. He had a recurring dream. Those of you who know the Lord of the Rings may remember the passage so it's right after Mount Doom and the destruction of the ring, and there's the kind of flashback in time to Faramir and Éowyn back in Minas Tirith, right, as they're waiting to hear, right? So we already know, the readers already know about, what's going to happen. But it goes back to Minas Tirith where nobody yet has heard the news, and this is where we get the really adorable sort of scenes between, Faramir, smooth operator, and Éowyn there in the Houses of Healing, right? But anyway, so in that passage, so they see like the cloud of darkness arise, right, which is Sauron rising up, and he's about to be dispersed, right? And so you'll remember they have that exchange where where Faramir says that really strange thing. He says, "It reminds me of Numenor," and Éowyn says, "Of Numenor?" And he says, "Yes." And he describes this huge green wave coming over and engulfing the entire, coming towards him and engulfing the entire land. And he says, "I often dream of it." That was Tolkien's actual experience, and he talked about this on many occasions and wrote several letters about it. He had a recurring dream throughout his life of the land sinking beneath the sea and this huge wave coming forward to engulf him. And the thing that made that dream especially interesting to him is that he discovered that his son Michael also had that dream and had been having that dream for a long time before he ever told him about it or they ever discussed it. So he had this recurring dream, and it seemed to be a hereditary recurring dream of what he identified with Atlantis, with the sort of the cataclysmic sinking of the island and the ocean overwhelming the land. So he as he said, he bequeaths his dream to Faramir, and included it in the Lord of the Rings. And in the Lord of the Rings, of course, is associated with Numenor. That's what Christopher Tolkien is referring to when he talks about his Atlantis haunting. That's Tolkien's own phrase. That's why he puts quotation marks around it. That Tolkien always had this Atlantis haunting. It was something that was kind of always in his mind and sort of on the edges of his sort of his kind of creative life. So I think that my guess is that that's the root of his memory, that it existed independently, because I think there probably was a sense in which this, at the very least, desire to write a story about Atlantis and the drowning of the land was always kind of in his mind. It doesn't mean he ever actually did it, because it doesn't look like he did ever actually do it. But that story was still kind of there. It was an unscratched itch for a long time as he was doing this other Silmarillion stuff. So this moment, which is actually him first writing this down and doing so in the context of the Middle-earth material of the Silmarillion, remained in his mind 30 years later as him finally taking this kind of pre-existing story and splicing it in to the Middle-earth context, the Silmarillion context. That narrative seems to me kind of the more plausible, based on the fact that the splicing business, because of the well, you could almost say sort of the violence that it does to the Silmarillion tradition. That's unfair. I don't mean to say that it doesn't fit or he does it clumsily or something like that. I don't mean to imply either one of those things. But what I was saying about how it really requires him to rethink, and really it's something that really alters the trajectory of the Silmarillion material very significantly when it gets added in there at the end. So I think that fact is perhaps another reason why, because he would why he sort of retained this internal narrative of, by putting in the Numenor stuff, it had to be kind of, sort of forced into or spliced onto the Silmarillion stuff. And so maybe that's another reason that he kind of thought of it that way. So that's why I wanted to emphasize the mental slip thing and the context of this. What I want to do for the rest of today, we're going to be looking at the Fall of Numenor, his first prose version of the story. And I want to be looking at this, again, not just comparing and contrast. The Akallabeth, of course, in the Silmarillion is sort of the ultimate version of the Numenor story, pretty much, more or less. It wouldn't have been had he finished other things he was writing, like The Lost Road, of course, primarily. But as far as completed works are concerned, the Akallabeth is sort of the final statement of it. I'm not going to be doing a lot of comparing and, sort of detailed going back and forth, comparing and contrasting with the Akallabeth. Instead, what I want to do is I want to look at this as what it is, as the beginning of the Numenor story. And I want to be thinking, what are the original elements? Like, what was the Numenor story about from the beginning, right? So in some ways, rather than comparing forward to what we get in The Lord of the Rings and in the published Silmarillion, I want to forget about it. And I want to forget we ever knew any of that stuff and just focus on this and really see, when he sits down to write the Numenor story, what is it really primarily about? So I'm going to start with, I'm going to look at a lot of the original outline that he wrote, his original scheme, because this is of particular interest to me because it shows us, in a way, an outline is even more fun. In one way, an outline is even more fun than the fully drafted narrative because it shows us what are the important plot elements, right? So when he was jotting down the important skeleton of the story, what were those bones? What were really the central elements of the story? So I want to go through, and so there are 4 elements that I've identified that seem to me to be, based upon the outline that he gives us, really close to the heart of the story. And now we've finally come to the point where I'm going to really be looking for much active participation from you guys. As I read these passages, I want you to make observations. What jumps out at you? What things do you notice? And I'll try to read and respond to as many of your comments as I can. All right. Element number 1, Atalante, the Downfallen. The last battle of the gods. Men side largely with Morgoth. After the victory, the gods take counsel. Elves are summoned to Valinor. Struck out, faithful men dwell in the lands. The lands would be the Great Lands, what later on will be called Middle-earth. Those of you who did do the other classes will recall the phrase Middle-earth hasn't been used in any of the first 4 volumes of the history of Middle-earth. What we think of as Middle-earth, he called the Great Lands in his early writing. So the lands, I think, are clearly, that's what he's referring to there. So notice, even in this outline, in the first paragraph of the outline, so that first paragraph, he's going over the end of the Silmarillion material, right? And even there, he starts with faithful men dwell in the lands, and he strikes that out, right? So this idea of like the separate land of Numenor, it's still growing, right? Many men had not come into the old tales. They are still at large on earth. The fathers of men are given a land to dwell in, raised by Osse and Aule in the great western sea. The western kingdom grows up. Atalante, added in margin. Legend so named it afterward. The old name was Numar or Numenos. Atalante equals the falling. Okay? All right, so what do you notice? What do you notice? What do we see at the beginning of this? What do we see as the heart of the Numenor story? Where does the Numenor story begin, right? To me, what's really fascinating are the 2 elements that we can see side by side, absolutely wedded together from the very beginning of the Numenor story, right? Thing number 1, the fathers of man are given a land to dwell in, right? So we have this idea of the reward of the faithful men. So men are good, and some men make really good choices, right? And are rewarded by the gods. But the second thread, of course, is Atalante, the falling, right? The fall of Numenor is there from the beginning, right, is an essential part of the story from the very beginning. The first name that the Western Kingdom is given is Atalante, which of course looks shockingly like Atlantis, naturally. I say naturally, but of course it's totally defensible. Tolkien says, and Christopher Tolkien repeats on lots and lots of occasions, this is not just Tolkien naming Numenor after the Isle of Atlantis. This is a word, this is a name, Atalanta, which is derived from the languages that he had already made, that he had made years and years before this. And you can go back and look in his earlier writings on these languages and his early word lists and all of that stuff. And Christopher quotes several examples of this where the name Atalanta is based on the root for falling or tripping or falling down, and that's it's just a coincidence. It's possible that it's just a coincidence, that it is chance, if chance we call it. I don't. Josh, as Josh Ramsey points out, you can see it in the etymologies in this very book. If you look up tal, T-A-L, it means to fall. And that's the root of Atalanta. Or Talat, yeah, exactly, Josh. I don't believe that it was just a coincidence. As Kate Neville says, Tolkien is a coincidence wizard. I agree. I mean, I would be willing to think that the causality goes the other way around. Given the fact that Tolkien had this Atlantis haunting for much of his life, I would not be in the least surprised to discover that the name of Atlantis was influencing the words that he chose to represent the concept of to fall, that had been somewhere at least at the back of his mind, years before when he was first writing his word lists in his language. But anyway, that's so again, I don't buy that it's 100% strangely coincidental any more than I buy that Avalone, the name of the Lonely Isle, is just coincidentally almost exactly the same as the Isle of Avalon, which is the traditional Isle of Faery off in the sea, that King Arthur is taken to in the Arthurian stories. Don't buy that either, though that also can be shown through the etymologies to merely be a product of Tolkien's invented languages. Anyway, okay, couple other observations that you guys are making. Arthur has a great observation. Why falling, not fallen? Do I think? I agree, Arthur. That's a really interesting question, or that's a really interesting observation. I mean, it's the difference, right, between the present participle and the past participle. Why present participle instead of the past participle? I guess, yeah, the published Akalabeth uses the fallen, the downfallen. Yeah, exactly. I guess I would say, my first impulse to that is that they seem to be given from different points of view. The Akalabeth is much more firmly looking back on it from a post-Numenorean point of view, right? Like from a Gondorian point of view, from the Elendil perspective. And so Numenor is in the past tense from the beginning, right? From the beginning of the story, it's in the past tense. And it's part of the tragedy, right? Which is encoded in the story of Numenor as it's told in the Akalabeth from the very beginning. This suggests to me that the way he's thinking about this is less so, and it makes sense, right? He's not looking back at the story of Numenor from the Third Age. Third Age doesn't exist yet, right? This is the sequel. This is the new material. This is the modern world, right? So he's telling the story of the falling, not of that thing which has fallen, right? Maybe. Anyway, it certainly seems to have that effect, or to invite us to kind of look at it that way. Yeah, good. Now, Don, you were making a really good point that it's interesting that it's the falling and not like the drowning or something like that. That is the inclusion of the word fall is kind of conspicuous from a Christian, from a Catholic standpoint. I certainly agree, Don. I mean, I don't think the Garden of Eden echo that we get there. I mean, there is, of course, because you're right, in a sense, Don, the verb drowning would seem to be more obviously fitting. If it were merely an objective description of what happens to Numenor, I mean, it kind of falls, right? Like physically tumbles into the abyss. But that doesn't really seem to kind of justify the choice. Mary, as you say, all stories are ultimately about the fall, Tolkien said, and I think we can hear that in his choice of the terms there. So, which shows us, of course, it gives us a clue already here in the second paragraph of the outline. It gives us a clue about what kind of story we're going to be reading, what kind of tragedy we're going to be reading. The fact that it's called The Falling tells us this is going to be a tragedy. Right, but it also tells us what kind of. This is not just a disaster story. This is not just the tragedy of this great society that has been lost, or this this paradise which has been lost to us. But it's not just a story about a paradise which has been lost. It's a paradise lost story, right? It's about how not just the land of Numenor has fallen, but the people of Numenor have fallen. In this sense, Rachel makes a wonderful observation. Rachel Oreskovich says, falling is something you do. Drowning happens to you. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. It does come down to human agency, Rachel, I agree. And it does emphasize the agency of humans, I agree. Kelly, we're going to come back around to, I don't want to talk about Faramir too much at this point. Again, we'll come back around to the Third Age perspective later on, but I want to focus on what we see within the frame of this text for now. Exactly, Chuck. It gives us a prime to look at, not the material fall, but the sort of the psychic or the moral fall, of Numenor. Absolutely, Cecilia, I agree. Drowning might indicate more of an accident, something that wasn't the person or the island's fault, right? But this fall was clearly somebody's fault, and that's pointed to in the very beginning with the parallel, with that Garden of Eden parallel that we do kind of inescapably get there. All right, let's keep going. Original element number 2, Thu, the evil one who brings evil to the island of Numenor. Thu comes to Atalante, heralded, read heralding, that's Christopher Tolkien's note, heralding the approach of Morgoth. But Morgoth cannot come except as a spirit being doomed to dwell outside the walls of night. The Atalanteans fall and rebel. They make a temple to Thu Morgoth. They build an armament and assail the shores of the gods with thunder. Okay. All right. So Thu, the name Thu will be familiar to people who have been studying with us before. We are introduced to the character of Thu in the Lay of Leithian, in the Lays of Beleriand, during the Beren and Luthien story. When Beren is on his way to Angband to try to take the Silmaril from Morgoth, he is captured by the necromancer Thu and held prisoner, where, of course, he's eventually rescued by his far more powerful girlfriend. So Thu, of course, will become Sauron, and obviously we see that happen over the course of this chapter, obviously. So we have, remember, this is a sequel, right? This is a sequel to the story that he's already written. So so this is significant. Even for no other reason, this is significant because we get his choice of a new villain, right? Morgoth has been banished. Is he just going to have Morgoth return, right? No. That many sequels do that, right? He's not going to do that. He emphasizes here Morgoth can't actually come except as a spirit, right? So he can have some kind of influence Morgoth can over the world, but Morgoth can't himself come back. And we saw Morgoth operating as tempter, especially of Feanor and the Noldor in Valinor in the earlier Silmarillion materials. Morgoth, however, cannot play that role. So we have the choice, and this happens from the very, very beginning, from this first outline of the Numenor story. We elect Morgoth's successor, his former lieutenant Thu, who will soon be renamed Sauron. And he plays a role which is parallel to the one that Morgoth played, but it's not exactly parallel. It's not entirely parallel. That is, he does more, or at least different things, than Morgoth did with the Noldor back in Valinor. The primary difference, of course, is that Thu doesn't seek, according to this account, Thu doesn't seek to bring worship to himself entirely, right? He comes as a prophet, heralding the approach of Morgoth. He comes prophesying that Morgoth is going to return, and that they, the Atalantians or the Númenóreans, should worship him, right? But there is clearly an element of Thu worship involved, right? As Josh was pointing out, that Thu Morgoth business, right? Make a temple to Thu. It's a temple to Morgoth, right? Which Thu encourages them to make, but it's clear that some element of Thu worship also takes place there. So Thu does not come in saying, I am the real God, worship me instead and do what I say. That's not his approach. His approach is as a prophet of a greater God, and yet he also does draw worship unto himself. Okay. Good. Kate Neville points out that we see, of course, the fall of the men happens before the fall of the land. Yes, we can see clearly how the fall of the land is going to be consequent from the fall of the people. Yeah. Josh is asking, does this mean that the Thu and Morgoth are conflated into one object of worship? It's not that clear. It's possible. This is just an outline, right? So it could be that one sentence, they make a temple to Thu-Morgoth, could contain an entire story, which might be like the ultimate story we get in the Akallabeth, right? Of how it's a temple to Morgoth, right? But people come to worship Thu himself as a god over the course of time. We see that in the Akallabeth. It's possible that kind of story might be in his head when he jots down that really short sentence, right? It's a little unclear. Anyway, good. Okay, so Jordan, great observation. With thunder, why does it say assail the shores of God with thunder? Jordan asks, does that mean something like cannon fire? Jordan, I believe that is exactly what that means, and this is something that we will see again and again through this earlier material. The Númenóreans are just the might in arms of the Númenóreans is described as being inconceivably great, completely overwhelming. And I remember, actually, when I first read the Akallabeth, one of the things that I was wondering was, like, in what sense? Like, okay, like, I get that the Númenóreans were bigger, and they had better weapons, I guess, and better armor, I guess. And there were a lot of them, I guess, though they're from this island, right? I mean, it's not like, how could they... So I'm thinking of the story of how, and we'll get to the precursor of this later on, the story of how when Ar-Pharazôn shows up on the shores to attack Sauron, and Sauron's whole army just runs away, right? And Sauron himself just comes and gives and surrenders. What is it about the Númenórean army that so utterly overwhelmed that, like, no one else would even stand against them? I mean, it can't be that they're so numerous. They can't be more numerous than an army that Sauron would have put in the field. I mean, I just can't believe that. From the island of Númenor, even with conscripts from the shores of Middle-earth, I don't buy it. Sauron obviously could have conscripted as many people as the Númenóreans, so it can't be the weight of numbers. What then was it? better armor and weapons. I mean, okay, maybe their armor was super awesome, and maybe they had these awesome steel bows we learn in Unfinished Tales, and they maybe their swords were super cool, but how could you tell that from a distance? I mean, if you're looking at an army with better, it never seemed quite enough. I could never fully wrap my own imagination around what would make their armies so amazing and so powerful that no one would even dare to stand up to them, to engage them in battle. What we will see here, and Jordan, I think you rightly touch on, you can see the hint of it right here in this first outline, the with thunder business. He imagines the technological advancement of the Númenóreans, and they are going to have something like what we would call modern weapons. They are going to have artillery fire. And it is the cannon fire and the artillery of the Númenóreans that they're going to be bringing to bear against Valinor in their battle, and that to me seems entirely to explain how this could be, right? A few artillery rounds shot into the middle of, like the hillmen who have been armed and mustered by Sauron. That would do the trick. Everybody running away and nobody even daring to stand up against them. Heck, the army wouldn't even have had to land on the shore, right? They could fire from their ships and pretty much solve the problem, right? So yeah, that would pretty much do it for me. Brian Dimmick says this would be more evidence of their fall in Tolkien's mind, having seen World War I. Yes, I agree that it does seem very unlikely that having artillery was a sign of a good thing on the Númenóreans' part. Agreed, very much. And Cecilia, I love your comment. Yes, the Númenóreans do have some gall to come against the gods with cannons, with their little thunder, to come against, the land of Manwë, the god of thunder, right? The god of the air. Yeah. No, it does really emphasize the fact that he uses that phrase with thunder. Does, I think, really emphasize the irony and the kind of the pitiful irony of them coming up against the Valar there. Not to mention the open disrespect, right? As if they think they can turn the weapons of the Valar against them, right? Yeah. Tom Hillman points out that it's in this he's doing the opposite of Milton. Milton's Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost says that it was the thunder that made God the greater. Right? God had the power of thunder and could basically overwhelm Satan and his forces in battle, which we get in some detail in Canto 6 of Paradise Lost, and. So because God can thunder, that makes him the greatest, and so Tolkien is very, very much taking a different stance here. Good. Anyway, okay. So let's keep going. So this is element 2, the existence of Thu and his seduction of the Númenóreans and bringing about the blasphemous worship of Morgoth and their rebellion against the Valar. Element number 3. The gods therefore sundered Valinor from the earth, and an awful rift appeared, down which the water poured, and the armament of Atalante was drowned. They globed the whole earth, so that however far a man sailed, he could never again reach the west, but came back to his starting point. Thus new lands came into being beneath the old world, and the east and west were bent back, and water flowed all over the round earth's surface, and there was a time of flood. But Atalante, being near the rift, was utterly thrown down and submerged. The remnant of, struck out at time of writing, Numen, the Lian Numen, the Númenóreans, in their ships flee east and land upon Middle-earth. Struck out, Morgoth induces many to believe that this is a natural cataclysm. Okay. So, Yes, Josh, the gods sundered Valinor, not Iluvatar. So we see that it is not an original part of this story that the gods stepped back and did nothing, and Iluvatar steps in and does this unilaterally. This is in this original outline. It's the Valar themselves that do that. That yes, they had the power to remake Arda and cause the flood. Does that sound to you possibly like an echo of the Noahic flood? Yep, me too. But anyway. So this is how it works, right? Okay, so this is a central element, and we see, and if anything, this seems to be, if I had to point to one of the four elements I'm going to talk to, if I had to point to one, which seems to be the central element, the original element of the Numenor story, it would be this. It would be the falling and the making of the round world. Christopher describes how at the beginning of the outline is that diagram that Tolkien made, right? The diagram of the flat Earth that was, right? The old world, which is the flat, which is the flat Earth, and then the globe, which is now down beneath it, and the old world still exists, but it's now like tangential to the world, right? And you can't you can't go straight anymore, you go down, so that any travel is now falling again, right? You can't any longer go straight out towards the gods. You can only go down towards the bottom of the world, right? That's all you can now do. So this business of the transformation of the world from a flat world to a round world, and the remaining existence of the old world existing in some sense on a kind of a plane above the old world, of the new round world, that is a huge element of the old story. Yes, Kate, you're right to point out he's still using the word gods to refer to the Valar. He's not made that shift where he just calls them the Valar and doesn't call them gods anymore. That he's been doing that, calling them gods, that is, from the beginning of the Book of Lost Tales. Yeah, exactly. And good, Josiah, I agree. Really interesting that there is no faithful remnant that hung back. Absolutely. And that's the last thing that I want to look at. We don't get the story. Notice that the outline contained no hint of the division between the faithful and the king's men, right? The strife in Numenor and those who remained true. We don't get any of that. We just get the Númenóreans collectively, their king and queen and the Númenórean people collectively turning against, going bad, falling and turning against the Valar. And then the entire land of Adelante sinking. And then finally, at the very end, we get the fourth element. That is the first gropings toward the last alliance. The longing of the Númenóreans, their longing for life on earth, their ship burials and their great tombs, some evil and some good. Many of the good sit upon the west shore. These also seek out the fading elves. How, struck out at time of writing, Aguldor, changed to Amroth, wrestled with Thu and drove him to the center of the earth and the iron forest. There you go. There's the beginning of the last alliance. Okay, so again, what are our elements here? There are survivors. First, there are survivors of Numenor, right? Some do survive Numenor and end up in Middle-earth, and their remnants continue. Now, this is not like what we get later on. Again, remember, we don't have the division between the King's Men and the Faithful, right? We don't have, like, the good Númenóreans and the bad Númenóreans already pre-downfall, right? We just have the Númenóreans, and they've all fallen, right? They've all fallen. And but some of them survive. Some of those fallen Númenóreans survive. Now, that doesn't mean they're wholly evil. What he seems to be emphasizing when he says some evil, some good, is although, like the people of Numenor fell into evil and stuff, they weren't all bad, right? Some of them were good. So it doesn't seem like he's saying, and some of those were evil. It seems like the emphasis is the other way around, and some of them were actually good, right? But that longing, the fall of Numenor is still in their hearts, right? They're still longing for life on Earth. They're still focused on burials and tombs, right? That in Middle-earth, mind, right? That's the prime characteristic that we're given to describe the culture of the Numenorians in Middle-earth. They're longing for extended life and their focus on burials and tombs. But some of them are good, and some of the good ones are on the West Shore. Many of the good ones are on the West Shore, and some of those also seek out the elves. Okay, so there are still elves. They're fading, but they're still there, right? And one of the Numenorians, Amroth, wrestled with Thu and drove him to the center of the earth. Now, first of all, I assume, by the way, that when he says the center of the earth, he doesn't mean the center of the earth in the Dantean sense. That is Dante in not Paradise Lost. That's Milton. Dante in the Divine Comedy in Inferno describes Satan as being imprisoned at the very center of the earth. So hell, in Dante's version, hell is the concavity that's made when Satan falls and crashes into the earth, not because Satan struck the earth with concussive force and made a dent in it, but rather, in this lovely description, it's the hole that's made because earth shrank away in horror from Satan as he was descending. I absolutely love that touch by Dante. Anyway, so the earth has kind of shriveled back from Satan, but there he is, and he's at the very center, the gravitational center of the earth is Satan. In fact, the precise gravitational center of the earth in Dante's Inferno is Satan's genitalia. Anyway, and exactly, Josh, that's how Mount Purgatory comes about, because when the earth shrinks down away from Satan on one side of the globe, it pops out on the other side into Mount Purgatory. And so in that way, from the beginning, conceptually, Purgatory is the inverse of hell. So beautiful. Boy, Dante's, I can't even say enough about how gorgeous Dante's construction is. Anyway, okay, so the center, by the center of the earth, I don't think he means down in the center of the earth in that way, but rather he drives him to the center of the earth, meaning to a place in the middle of the Great Lands, and that place is the Iron Forest. And several of you are very interested in the Iron Forest. That it's a very, and Roy is saying how it's a very evocative name, certainly. Agreed. Arthur is recalling that both Angband is connected both with hell, which this sounds like Thu is being imprisoned here, but also with iron, right? It was the hells of iron is what Angband meant. Is it the same? No, I think it's definitely not the same. And I feel pretty confident. But remember when he wrote this, right? 1936. Christopher Tolkien's thinking 1936. He's already written The Hobbit. He's already got Thu the Necromancer in a forest in the middle of in the center of the earth, right? In a dark forest in the center of the earth. It's Mirkwood. The Iron Forest is Mirkwood, right? I think that identity is already pretty clear at this point. Chuck is asking, wasn't Amroth the lover of Nimrodel here? Yeah. Amroth was the lover of Nimrodel. Amroth has a really fascinating history in Tolkien's mind. I had totally forgotten. I was, when I was rereading this, preparing for class tonight, I had completely forgotten that Amroth was in here. Tolkien had stories about Amroth, who's like the king of Lorien before Galadriel and Celeborn came, and he's the one that Carayn Amroth is named after, the hill. And so there's this like whole backstory for him, but his story is like sort of never, the only one that's ever told is the bit about him and Nimrodel in the poem. but now we see actually, no. The story of Amroth goes back further still, right? This is a name or a concept that's been kind of kicking around. So yeah, James, I think this is clearly Tolkien recycling the name, or rather he's going to later on recycle the name. Originally, this later Númenórean hero, or this hero of Númenórean descent, who rose up and opposed Thu and wrestled with him and imprisoned him, or at least drove him out, was Ageldor, and then he changes quickly that to Amroth, and of course, as we're going to see, he's going to change Amroth, and before too long, Amroth is going to become Elendil. But yet, Tolkien almost never forgets a name, and rarely sets a name aside entirely. So Amroth, the name, gets recycled later on when he wants. But poor Amroth, is a name that was in Tolkien's mind for a long time and keeps coming back, but never really gets a really central place. Anyway. Okay, good. All right, so those are the four elements that I would identify that just jump out to me as the most important in this early outline. So we got the idea of the falling, right? Thu, and how the fall comes about, right? So the temptation of Thu and the rebellion against the gods, the flat world made round as a consequence of the fall. And as a making permanent of the ban of the Númenóreans that they can't come to the Undying Lands. And then finally the story of the last alliance, that eventually from the Númenóreans comes one who will rise up and rebel against Thu. So that in a sense, the story of Númenor is not actually intended just to end in tragedy. It doesn't just end on a down note, right? It ends with the fact that hope for Middle-earth is born out of Númenor. Right? That seems to me an essential element of the story from the very, very beginning. And James, of course, you're right. The existence of the straight path as part of the world made round, definitely part of that a core part of that third element that I was describing. Okay, with that in mind, let's start looking at a few of the passages from the first narrative that he writes. And I'm obviously not going to finish everything I wanted to talk about tonight, but that's okay. We got plenty of time, lots of time, and we're going to keep talking. So next time we'll finish up talking about the fall of Númenor and start the Lost Road. But let's keep going anyway. Okay, so here's the prose, the narrative. Oh, it was prose before, but the full narrative version. But the Númenóreans tarried not long yet in Middle-earth, for their hearts hungered ever westward for the undying bliss of Valinor, and they were restless, and pursued with desire even at the height of their glory. Okay, so tarried not long yet in Middle-earth is in the context of saying the Númenóreans have become great mariners, right? And they explore everywhere, and they've gone back to visit Middle-earth, but they're not staying there, right? So the mind of the Númenóreans was not focused on colonizing Middle-earth, which it might well have been, right? But that's not their deal, right? Their deal is they're hungering ever westward for the undying bliss of Valinor. So we see in this first full version of the story, the core of the Númenórean experience, right? The core of the Númenórean story is their longing, their hungering for the undying bliss, and the restlessness which is engendered by this longing, right? But the gods forbade them to sail beyond the lonely isle, and would not permit any save their kings, once in each life before he was crowned, to land in Valinor. So that's interesting, right? The kings of Númenor did get to go to Valinor once, right, before their crowning. It was apparently like a ritual thing. And yes, Arthur, they can get to the Lonely Isle, right? So that's a major difference, right? We do have sort of closer, so they're able to come closer, even to get a taste of the Undying Land, right? But they can't, most of them can't go, and not even the kings can stay. For they were mortal men, and it was not in the power and right of Manwë to alter their fate. Thus, though the people were long-lived, since their land was more lie than other lands to Valinor, and many had looked long on the radiance of the gods that came faintly to tall Eressëa, they remained mortal, even their kings, that is, the ones who went to Valinor, and their span brief in the eyes of the Eldar. And they murmured against this decree, and a great discontent grew among them, and their masters of lore sought unceasingly for the secrets that should prolong their lives, and they sent spies to seek these in Valinor, and the gods were angered. Okay. I find the idea of them sending spies, Josh, kind of mind-blowing too, right? Yeah, they sent spies. I don't know what kind of spies, James. Maybe animals. Maybe they sent birds that they could talk to, and maybe I don't know. Did they sneak? Did they go to Tol Eressëa and some of the Númenóreans stayed behind and like dressed in black and wore masks and like paddled little dinghies across to Valinor and sneaked over to spy out the land? I don't know. I no clue how they sent spies. Karita suspects cats. That's possible. That could be part of the history, the long history of devious wickedness that cats have been a part of in Tolkien's world. But anyway, okay, so yeah, that's all really interesting stuff. I would point out that, notice the bigger picture here. The longevity of the Númenóreans is derivative of their proximity to the Undying Lands, right? So the length of life that they have is, in fact, a side effect of their getting to be close. They live longer than the men of Middle-earth, not because they've been gifted with long life, but as a natural consequence of visiting Tol Eressëa and getting, even from afar, the light of Valinor shining upon them, right? This lengthens their lives and gives them this blessing, right? So if you're thinking in Akallabeth terms, remember the debate in the Akallabeth that says it is not the lands that make the undying, it's not the lands that make people undying, it's the undying who dwell there that bless the lands. You're mistaken, O Númenóreans, right? No, they weren't. not originally, right? In this original story, there is something, in fact, special about the lands. Because yes, the elves aren't immortal because they live in the Undying Lands. That's still true. That's just their fate. But the Undying Lands do seem to have this, they do clearly have an influence on the men because of the blessing of the gods who live there. So would they actually become undying if they made it? If they succeeded in their rebellion and succeeded in like colonizing Valinor, would they have become immortal? I doubt it. It says that they were, their fate couldn't be altered, right? They remained mortal. So I don't think they would in fact become immortal, but that seemed to be what they were shooting for. But again, it seems to be a not implausible goal on their part, right? Okay. We get the fleshing out of the Tempter, who now gets an extra name, right? He's still called Thu occasionally, but now he gets another name, which is Sur. And in time it came to pass that Sur, whom the gnomes called Thu, came in the likeness of a great bird to Númenor, and preached a message of deliverance, and he prophesied the second coming of Morgoth. But Morgoth did not come in person, but only in spirit and as a shadow upon the mind and heart, for the gods shut him beyond the walls of the world. But Sur spake to Angor the king and Istar his queen, and promised them undying life and lordship of the earth, and they believed him, and fell under the shadow, and the greatest part of the people of Númenor followed them. Angor raised a great temple to Morgoth in the midst of the land, and Sur dwelt there. Okay, yes, the gnomes are the Noldor. That's the old name for the Noldor. They've been called that. They're called that in The Hobbit, even. So the gnomes. The gnomes are just the Noldor. Okay, so exactly, Carson. You see the impact here, the bird thing. That's a really fascinating thing. So Sur Thu comes to Númenor as Tempter, right? As false prophet and Tempter. He's not taken in. There's not a rivalry. He just shows up, right? With apparently this mission to seduce the people of Númenor and to corrupt them, right? And he comes with signs and wonders, right? He comes in the likeness of a great bird and preaches a message of deliverance. And yes, the great bird, Carson, I agree with you, is clearly a significant thing, right? With the great eagles being the symbols of Manwë. So he comes and it would seem Carson initially aping, right? Imitating or kind of playing off of the authority of Manwë himself, so that some doubt would presumably be created initially. Where is he a messenger of the gods? Right? Is this a messenger from Manwë? Is this one of the eagles of the Lords of the West who has come to us with these tidings? Yeah, exactly. Josh calls him the anti-eagle, right? It's like the Antichrist, but more avian. Yeah, like the Antichrist, but more feathers. Exactly. Yeah. So okay, so that's it. Now Yana is wondering if he comes and he lands in the midst of the land, is that the raising of the temple in the midst of the land, is that saying that it's raised on the Meneltarma, which is more extreme than we get earlier on. We're kind of headed there, but not exactly, because the Meneltarma doesn't exist yet. That is, there's been no evidence of the existence of the Meneltarma yet. We're getting there, but it's not there yet. So I don't think we're quite there yet. But anyhow, we're definitely moving there. Yes, Rachel, I agree with you. Rachel Draper is noticing some of the phrasing and even some of sort of the cadencing here, which is very like biblical language, direct echoes of King James language, of traditional English Bible language, signs and wonders, a message of deliverance. There is definitely a sort of a biblical turn to some of this narrative. I absolutely agree with you there. Okay. Now the prose version of the assault on the gods. Wherefore the Númenóreans made a great armament, and their might and skill had in those days become exceedingly great, and they had moreover the aid of Sur. So we have some sort of sorcery involved as well, presumably. The fleets of the Númenóreans were like a great land of many islands, and their masts like a forest of mountain trees, and their banners like the streamers of a thunderstorm, and their sails were black. They still have sailing ships, not steamers, right? So there's that. And they moved slowly into the west, for all the winds were stilled, and the world lay silent in the fear of that time. And they passed Tol Eressëa, and it is said that the elves mourned and grew sick, for the light of Valinor was cut off by the cloud of the Númenóreans. But Angor assailed the shores of the gods, and he cast bolts of thunder, and fire came upon the sides of Taniquetil. So the casting bolts of thunder and fire seems to suggest even more clearly the artillery of the Númenóreans at work there, Jordan, as you were perceiving way back in the outline. And I also wonder about the cloud, cut off by the cloud of the Númenóreans. I mean, he's just compared the ships to islands and the masts to the forest on the islands, and their banners like the streamers of a thunderstorm, and their sails were black. So the sails are like a big black cloud with the streamers of a thunderstorm. Hover. So a black cloud hovering over the island of forests. It's possible that's just what he's moving to, but I'm not sure. I'm wondering, Josh, if there's actual smoke involved there as well. If the cloud of the Númenóreans is a more literal cloud, perhaps cutting off the light. I'm not really sure, but it seems to me very, very plausible. Yana's asking if this is a metaphorical cloud. I don't think there are aircraft here, Yana. We do hear about aircraft later on, but every time we hear about aircraft, it's in the post-downfall era when the Númenórean remnants are living in Middle Earth. So they are going to make they are going to have flying vehicles, but we don't have any evidence that they have them yet. And yeah, Kimber, that's a great observation. Kimber is noticing how the conflict between the Númenóreans and the gods is made to sound like a battle between gods, not between men and gods. The whole casting bolts of thunder thing sounds very Zeus-like, doesn't it, Kimber? I mean, it does sound like they're fighting the gods with the weapons of the gods themselves. And yeah, Tom Hillman and also Joyce Sturgill were also both thinking of the darkness that comes from Mordor, right? The dawnless day in the Return of the King, and how the encroachment of the Númenórean fleet is described in that same kind of way. Yeah, good. And the survivors. But Númenor being nigh upon the east to the great rift, was utterly thrown down and overwhelmed in sea, and its glory perished. But a remnant of the Númenóreans escaped the ruin in this manner, partly by the device of Angor, that is the king, and partly by of their own will, because they revered still the lords of the west and mistrusted Sur. Many had abode in ships upon the east coast of their land, lest the issue of war be evil. Wherefore, protected for a while by the land, they avoided the draught of the sea, and a great wind arose, blowing from the gap, and they sped east and came at length to the shores of Middle-earth in the days of ruin. There they became lords and kings of men, and some were evil, and some were of good will. But all alike were filled with desire of long life upon earth, and the thought of death was heavy upon them, and their feet were turned east, but their hearts were westward. And they built mightier houses for their dead than for their living, and endowed their buried kings with unavailing treasure. I love that sentence. And endowed their buried kings with unavailing treasure. Unavailing treasure is just a wonderful phrase. It would be a good name for like a mutual fund or something. But anyway, okay, so the survivors, right? Notice we were looking before at how, the survivors of Númenor, we didn't have the clear faithful versus kingsmen thing. In the narrative version, we get a little bit more of that, right? We do hear that most of the Númenóreans side with the king and worship Morgoth along with Sur. But not all of them do, and some of them remained faithful to their friends, the elves. We get a little bit of that, right? But we don't get any clear sense of the sort of the strife among them. We don't get really the sort of the political lines sharply drawn there. But more importantly, that doesn't really play a major role in the aftermath. Those who survive the downfall of Númenor, who sail off, in ships from the downfall of Númenor, are part and part, right? Some of them seem to be shirkers who were hiding from the war, and not participating in the war because they were faithful. They still revered the lords of the West and mistrusted Sur. But some of them are there for policy reasons. It appears that the king of Númenor has deliberately left behind because he knows he might lose, right? That's kind of interesting in itself. In other words, notice one conclusion I would draw from this. It seems like a big conclusion to draw from this small thing, but I think there's other evidence besides this. Notice pride is not the overwhelming error of the Númenóreans in this early version. I mean, yeah, you kind of have to be a little bit on the arrogant side to attack the gods. Not saying that, but it's not the distinguishing feature. The overwhelming and blind arrogance that we see in our Pharazôn the Golden, eventually down the road, is not something that we see in King Angor of Númenor in this first version. King Angor of Númenor did go to rebel against the gods. He was convinced that that was the right thing to do, right? And he was now worshipping Morgoth, and he was trying to seize immortality and all that, but he thought he might lose, right? And so therefore he left some people behind who would survive just in case they lost and there were reprisals against Númenor, right, that they could take off. So that in itself, I think, is really interesting. And this means that those who sail away before the wind in their ships are not all good guys, right? This is not the remnant of Numenor, the only faithful. This is not like Noah, right? I mean, there's a Noah element in Elendil as he's preserved in the later stories, right? You know, the idea of like that one faithful house who still worship the Lord in the midst of an unbelieving and violent land, and you know, God preserved them and puts them on a ship and saves them while the rest of the land is drowned. I mean, there's definitely a kind of a Noah undercurrent in the Elendil story, right? His house is you know, sort of the last faithful house in Numenor, and his house alone are saved. So we don't get that. That's not part of the story. The story doesn't yet have that shape. Both good guys and bad guys are saved in the end, right? Some of them survive. And so that whole, what we saw in the outline, some of them were evil and some of them were good, is true not just of those who are in Middle-earth later on, down the road, generations later, but even in that first generation that were born before the wind and brought to Middle-earth and saved. So that, I think, is another really fascinating thing. But notice also what happens when they get to Middle-earth, right? All of them. What happens when they go, and this is not, notice it's not just like, and the bad guys, when they got to Middle-earth, continue to do bad things, right? All the Númenóreans, what is Númenórean culture in Middle-earth like? Some were evil and some were of goodwill, but all alike were filled with the desire of long life upon earth, and the thought of death was heavy upon them, and their feet were turned east, but their hearts were westward, and they built mightier houses for their dead than for their living. Now you'll remember in the appendix of The Lord of the Rings that we hear that eventually when Gondor reaches the peak of its power, it too starts to fall in this way, right? We hear that the post-Númenórean Gondorian culture also began to count ancestors more dearer than sons, and to build more and more elaborate tombs. But that's not, in the later versions, that's a repeat, right? It's a reprise of the Númenórean story. The story of the rise and fall of Gondor is in some ways like an echo, like a repetition of the Númenórean story. That's not what we get here, right? From the beginning, the phrase Númenóreans in exile is not used, but the Númenórean culture that arises in Middle-earth is from the beginning focused on, is from the beginning a mortuary culture, right? The thought of death is heavy upon them, and they build great tombs, and they're focused, and we saw that in the outline, right? So any greatness that emerges from the Númenóreans in Middle-earth emerges out of a culture which is still corrupt, which is still twisted, which is still in a post-fallen state. We don't get this kind of rebirth that we get through Elendil and the other faithful in Gondor, in Arnor later on. We just get a recapitulation, a continuation of the same sort of sorry moral state that the Númenóreans were in Middle-earth. And out of that sorry state comes the Last Alliance, right? So the shape of that story is quite different. More on this. The land, we get some of their actual mythology, which is really kind of cool. Wherefore the kingdoms upon the west shores of the old world became a place of tombs and filled with ghosts. And in the fantasy of their hearts and the confusion of legends half forgotten concerning that which had been, they made for their thought a land of shades, filled with the wraiths of the things of mortal earth. And many deemed this land was in the west, and ruled by the gods, and in shadow the dead, bearing the shadows of their possessions, should come there, who could no longer find the true west in body. For which reason, in after days, many of their descendants, or men taught by them, buried their dead in ships, and sent them in pomp upon the sea by the west coasts of the old world. Really cool, right? Really interesting stuff. So we get the corruption, eventually, of the understanding of the Numenorians, right? So the post-Numenorian culture forgets about the true West. Their hearts are still focused on the West. Their desire is still for long life. They're still kind of obsessed with death and the attempt to prevent death. But they've forgotten the truth about the undying lands in the West. And so they identify the West as the land of desire, the place where you can go. But now only the dead can go there, right? It's now a land of shades. And in shadow, the dead can come there. The dead bearing the shadows of their possessions can come there, who can no longer find the true West in the body. You can't get to the true West anymore, right? The world is now round. It's not possible to but there is a place where ghosts can go. And this he explains is where the practice of burial ships, right? Sending the dead out in ships surrounded by their goods, because remember, the dead can bear the shadows of their possessions, according to this myth, right? That's why you send them with all their swag in the boat. They go out on these funeral ships. Does this mean they become Vikings? Kimber is asking, and Arthur is asking. No, not exactly. I would say it a little differently. Remember, it's their descendants or men taught by them, right? What this shows is that the tradition in Norse culture of doing this is derived from the Numenorians, right? What it shows, what he's doing here is establishing an explicit connection between the Numenorians of Middle-earth, the after history of the Numenorians of Middle-earth, and our history, right? So we're seeing how now this age is transitioning into the world of the Dominion of Men, right? The world that we know. Okay, so so that's pretty cool. But again, you see, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, see what I mean about the radical rewriting of the end of the mythology that he did, right? And again, that radical thing ultimately is the world made round, right? And the survival of the world in the straight path. Originally, you just had the world continuing, right? And transitioning from the world of elves to the world of men, right? The Dominion of Men comes in. Now we have a radical break, right? That moment of transition is removed, and it's given a completely different cause. Now it's because of men themselves, right? And the fall of the Numenorians, which precipitates the separation. So now it's not just that the gods and the elves withdraw into the West and kind of leave men to their own affairs in the Great Lands, which is kind of where we were at the end of the Silmarillion material previously. Now there's an absolute break, right? Now the Undying Lands are taken away entirely and utterly removed, so that now the idea of the Dominion of Men, it's still there, right? But it's been radically altered. Now the world has been completely reshaped. So the idea of, it's not just the idea of how we got to where we are from there has changed, as I was saying at the beginning, but the idea of what the now is, right? How radically the present day differs, the modern world differs from the elder days, has been greatly changed in Tolkien's mind, right? This is sort of the big shift that's come in. Okay. All right. Sorry, I'm looking ahead to see how many I think. Okay, two more, and we'll do them quickly because they're on this subject of the division of the world here. For the old line of the world remained in the mind of the gods and in the memory of the world as a shape and a plan that has been changed but endures. Okay, so the old flat world remains in the mind of the gods and in the memory of the world as a shape and a plan that has been changed but endures. That's a fascinating sentence. And it has been likened to a plane of air or to a straight vision that bends not to the hidden curving of the earth, or to a level bridge that rises imperceptibly imperceptibly but surely, above the heavy air of the earth. And of old, many of the Númenóreans could see or half see the paths to the true west, and believed that at times from a high place they could descry the peaks of Taniquetil at the end of the straight road, high above the world. This is why the Númenóreans became tower builders in Middle-earth, right? They built towers because if you could get up high enough, you could see afar in the distance down the true road into the true west, right? Some people, at some times, could see this. And notice it doesn't say just the faithful or anything like that. This is a Númenórean thing, right? So they become tower builders, and they build they build the hopes in order to hope to see it, right? But of course, being the Númenóreans and still fallen and still kind of the same way that they were, they're not content with merely trying to look down it. They want to try to sail on it, right? But upon the straight road, only the gods and the vanished elves could walk, or such as the gods summoned of the fading elves of the round earth, who became diminished in substance as men usurped the sun. So the fading of the elves and their diminishing in substance, becoming either invisible or actually diminutive, which is something that he had talked about in the early mythology, is still there as a possibility. Some elves are still here in the round world, right? But they're actually diminishing and fading. But they can go, if they're summoned by the gods, they can go on the straight road. For the plane of the gods being straight, whereas the surface of the world was bent, and the seas that lay upon it, and the heavy airs that lay above. So we've got the round earth, and the oceans on top of the earth, and the air surrounding the globe of the earth, right? But above all those things is the plane of the gods, right? It cuts through the air of breath and flight, and traversed Ilmen, the outer air beyond the atmosphere, right, in which no flesh can endure. And it is said that even those of the Númenóreans of old who had the straight vision didn't comprehend this. They didn't get the fact that they were on a round world and the straight plane went out. They didn't understand. So they tried to devise ships that would rise above the waters of the world and hold to the imagined seas, but they achieved only ships that would sail in the air of breath. Can I just say I love that really dismissive thing? You know, to hear most people talk, you'd think that like the devising of flying machines was a big deal, right? Like air travel is some kind of major accomplishment that like does really good things. I love Tolkien's dismissive, but they achieved only ships that would sail in the air of breath. I mean, no big deal, right? I mean, what a paltry achievement and a horrible disappointment. Okay, so yeah, it's Thomas is surprised that Tolkien would sort of dabble in writing about aircraft. Yeah, he does a little bit, but not that much, right? He doesn't dwell on it. And as Christopher Tolkien points out, this is these references in this chapter are the only references to flying machines that Tolkien will ever make in any of his writings ever in his entire life. So this is it. But there we go. Yana, I don't know if they're heavier or lighter than air. I mean, I don't know if these are Zeppelins or if they're or dirigibles. I prefer the word dirigible because it's a funnier word. But anyway, I don't know if they're dirigibles or if they're airplanes or what. But I don't know. Anyway, so okay, don't forget Christopher Tolkien himself served in the Royal Air Force in World War II. So there's some sort of extra kind of irony there. But yeah, Tom Hillman thinks that the flying machines actually strengthen the argument for thunder as artillery. Yeah, it does suggest that they have not lost all of their technological advancement when they go to Middle-earth. Okay. All right, so by the way, thinking of the Númenóreans as tower builders and how you could, from the top of the tower, you could just see, remember the hills, the Emyn Berain, that the tower where the last Palantir is, that Elendil built on the shores of the sea, out in the Tower Hills to the west of the Shire, and the Palantir that is set upon that tower, which is only kind of oriented out towards Tol Eressëa, and it's not good for anything else. That concept of Elendil building a tower on the coast in order to look down the straight path is a remnant of this old idea. We can see it's still this concept still still existed in Tolkien's mind when he was writing that bit about Elendil, I think. Cecilia says, what about Earendil's ship? Well, that's an airship technically in that it flies. It's true, but it's not a flying machine is the main thing. And that's what Christopher Tolkien is talking about flying machines. Earendil's ship is a ship that is set to sail in the sky by the Valar, which is a totally different thing. He meant the construction of like flying machines. Like even Morgoth doesn't do that or think of that. The winged dragons are kind of the closest that he ever gets. Okay, well, there's more to say, and especially I want to come back next time to we'll start our next session with more look. I want to do some more, pay some close attention to the developments of the story of the Last Alliance. That's the thing that kind of I think grows most in these early stages in the Fall of Numenor. So go back and review the Last Alliance stuff that we get in this chapter, and then we're going to start the Lost Road for next time. Okay. Thanks for joining me, everybody, tonight. Really fun first session here with you guys, and I look forward to next week. I think I'm going to be on the road again next week, so please do be patient if my internet connection is not great. I really don't know what my internet connection is going to be next week. I'm going to do my best to make everything happen next week as normal. Please bear with me if I end up having to reschedule. I promise I'll reschedule as soon as possible. But yeah, if you do, Mary, good question. If you have other questions or comments, you can email to me, and I might be able to come back and address some of those things in the next session as well. So yes, you can always do that. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Good night, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.